Something weird's been happening to me. There's new Marvel shows out, but I haven't cared to watch. There's more Marvel movies on the horizon, but I couldn't care less. There's plenty of videos out there explaining the downfall of the MCU, ones that I'd normally watch to commiserate with, but I haven't even bothered to do that either. I'm just apathetic about all things MCU. How can this be? I was the ultimate Marvel fangirl. Just 2 years ago, I couldn't stop talking about Marvel. My room is still covered in the Marvel posters and merchandise I've collected over the years. Marvel was my thing for the better part of 10 years. And now, I just don't care? What happened? I didn't grow up loving superheroes. I didn't watch too many of them. My first exposure to a superhero thing was a DVD of the Fleischer Superman cartoons, which I thought were boring. I knew who Spider-Man, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Wolverine were. That is, I knew what they looked like, but I never actually watched anything with those characters. Then there came a time where I started to see more posters for superhero movies I hadn't heard of, like Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor. Everyone was hyping up this new Avengers movie as the first of its kind, to bring an ensemble of superheroes who had already starred in their own movies together to create their own team. This is when I started watching, and I was hooked. The hype around the Avengers was like nothing we have seen for anything in the last 15 years. This movie was everywhere. The characters were everywhere. Oh my goodness, this movie exploded my mind. I don't think most people today truly acknowledge the mania that the first Avengers caused. I used to watch this movie literally once a day at one point. Marvel became my favorite thing to talk about. It unlocked something in my brain. It created the superhero boom of the 2010s. This is the film that made the MCU into the successful box office behemoth that it would become. But why was this movie such a big hit? What made people so excited for it? And there's been a lot of criticism for the MCU over the years, especially from auteur and former blockbuster directors. They seem to view Marvel movies as the same as Michael Bay Transformers movies, soulless films that entice audiences with nothing more than constant explosions. Might I just get up and say that I think that those people don't actually understand these films or what the audience was seeing in them. Sure, there were fight scenes and cool powers and awesome sound design. Yeah, we had charismatic actors and the movies came up with creative and explosive ways for them to interact. But there were a lot of films that had been released up to that point that were nothing more than a series of explosions that didn't catch the same fire as this series did. What made us connect with these movies so much was the characters. Specifically, these were very flawed characters. Each one of the protagonists that made up the Avengers team had some sort of demon in their past. They were selfish, they were out of control, they had been liars, they had been responsible for people's deaths.
So you're a man who has everything, and nothing.
I went under. The world was at war. I wake up, they say we won. They didn't say what we lost.
You are a vain, greedy, cruel boy!
I got low. I didn't see an end, so I put a bullet in my mouth, and the other guy spit it out.
You lie and kill. In the service of liars and killers. You pretend to be separate, to have your own code. Something that makes up for the horrors, but they are part of you. And they will never go away.
Whether it was Bruce Banner dealing with the isolation of trying to protect a world that hates him from the rage of the Hulk, or Captain America questioning the relevance of his morals in an ever-changing society, or Black Widow dealing with her own moral compromises and her own self-hatred for what she had been made to do in the past, or most of all Tony Stark's journey against his own self-centeredness, which manifests itself in different ways throughout the series, these were the characters we sympathized with and related to. But the overarching point of every movie is asking if these very flawed characters can set aside their demons and their differences to do something good. The reason why people loved the Avengers is they were human beings like us. They were flawed like us. They were not idealized. Rather, they tried to fight for the ideals we wish we'd see of people putting aside their flaws to become something greater, to always try to overcome their difficulty. It's really important to think of the average audience member when understanding the success of these movies. The average person in the world is just struggling through life, trying to pay their rent, trying to overcome their personal difficulty. What movies are to the average person is the escape from the troubles of the world, to see a universe where there are people just like them trying to rise above. People who can fight back the evil that we wish we could. These stories provided that escape and also the inspiration for people to keep going themselves. It blows my mind how there's some people out there who can't comprehend why superheroes connect with people on such a powerful level. The excitement of watching every subsequent movie was seeing what kind of development our favorite characters would undergo next, how the story would continue to be built upon with each installment. Okay, not everything was going to be perfect, and Marvel fans admit that. To me, the low point of the MCU was Avengers Age of Ultron, because this is the one that stumbled the most on the character's story and tone. Black Widow and Hulk's characters were momentarily ruined because director Joss Whedon wanted to force them into a romance. Meanwhile, the darker, higher stakes promised by the trailers were constantly undercut by bad humor, which would become a key issue in many Marvel films going forward. Their constant use of humor to chicken out of going to darker places in their narratives. Some of the movies really stumbled with their characters. Some of the movies seemed like they were turning up the humor and charisma of the actors up to 11 to cover up for the fact that they didn't have much of a story. But what kept us going through these various missteps was the fact that we cared about these characters so much. Even the lesser films in the series still provided building blocks for better films in the future. Age of Ultron continued to develop Tony Stark's growing fears and need for control, which led directly into Captain America: Civil War, a film which brought the inner conflicts of the team to a head, using them all to explore how revenge consumes and destroys.
Vengeance has consumed you. It's consuming them. I'm done letting it consume me.
Because these movies, at least a good chunk of them, do have something more to them. The Captain America films, particularly the ones by the Russo brothers, always explored darker political themes. A film like Winter Soldier, for example, has amazing action, sure. That car chase scene is probably one of the greatest action sequences I've ever experienced. But the writers once again kept it to the characters. Winter Soldier dealt with the theme of moral compromise. We saw that as Steve Rogers struggled to find his place in a modern world with his old-fashioned ideals, and how that connected to Black Widow, a morally confused character who comes to question that ambiguity and her place in the world, and how that story connected with Steve trying to rescue his former best friend who's a good man forcibly turned into a monster, and how that story connected to real-world fears at the time over surveillance. My goodness, never tell me that the MCU had nothing to it again. The Guardians of the Galaxy movies, meanwhile, are pretty edgy and dumb on the outside, and I was one of the few people who didn't even like the first movie. It wasn't until the second movie that I got it. I understood how this bickering, crude, messed up group was supposed to represent a family, and how these movies explore what truly constitutes a family.
You were the one who wanted to win, and I just wanted a sister!
He may have been your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy. I'm sorry I didn't do none of it right.
All any of you do is yell at each other. You are not friends.
You're right. We're family.
I saw how the edgiest, most flawed individuals can be the ones that are the most insecure and the most afraid. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 isn't even considered the best Marvel film by fans, but it shows that even one of the more flawed MCU movies still had things of value to offer. I'd also like to point out that the Guardians of the Galaxy films, both in style and tone, are very different from the Captain America films. That is, despite of people's claims that Marvel movies are all the same. I do see a lot more contrast in the director's styles for each of these films than people acknowledge. Even two comedic films like Guardians of the Galaxy or Thor Ragnarok have their own distinct styles. And despite agreeing that Marvel should have taken more risks at various points, Age of Ultron, I do think it's impressive that Marvel went for that long without a franchise killer. By franchise killer, I mean something like Batman and Robin or X-Men: The Last Stand that offended audiences to the point where they wouldn't come back. No, every Marvel stumble back in the day was met with a comeback. It continued to be supported by fans who believed in these characters and were invested in seeing the story through to the end. From Spider-Man: Homecoming, to Thor Ragnarok, to Black Panther, to Infinity War. And what better way to reward us for all our investment with the best movie in the entire series? A film that took all the character development and all the relationships and all of the story and brought it to a head. A movie that made the stakes clear from the very first few minutes as we saw the fall of our most powerful hero. It's not even a traditionally told superhero story. Rather, the movie's protagonist is its villain, Thanos. It's his story about his own delusional ideology and how he thinks he's going to save the universe by killing off half. As his character's quest is the center of the movie, the Russo directors were expertly able to weave in almost every other character and every other ongoing plot in the MCU into the film, continuing the stories of the major characters or even bringing some storylines to their climax and conclusion. Seeing Infinity War in theaters was one of my best memories. To see this film series that had brought everyone together and made people so happy, to have such an escape for one evening where our investment in this journey of over a dozen characters would be rewarded in the best fashion possible. But would the final movie, the final chapter in the entire saga, be able to meet all of our expectations for what this series has been building towards the entire time? The answer to that is complicated. There were fantastic points to Endgame, but also major issues. Hulk's ending, finally able to reconcile the Hulk with Banner, is great. It's just that we never got to see it develop on screen. He really should have gotten a rematch with Thanos as a payoff to the first movie, but he didn't. Black Widow's ending, likewise, finally making the ultimate sacrifice for the people she grew to care about after years of trying to make up for her past, would also have been a great payoff, if they had built up to it more. Maybe they could have developed these storylines a bit more in, I don't know, Age of Ultron! And that's not even to mention the beginning of the assassination of Thor's character, taking him from his peak appearance and turning him into a fat joke. Were the cracks in the MCU beginning to show more than ever? Perhaps. But honestly, I don't really blame the directors too harshly for the problems with this finale. Many of those things were problems they were saddled with because this was such a massive film universe with so many creatives and executives working on it, making different decisions and different mistakes. When you think about it, it really is a miracle that this series held together as much as it did. And despite Endgame's flaws, in my opinion, it just managed to pull through as a finale in the ways where it really counted. There were so many little payoffs throughout this movie to reward people who had been with this world since the beginning. Some character conclusions might not have stuck the landing, but others did, especially with the one that counted the most. We had been on this journey since day one with the story of Tony Stark, a man who cared about nothing, who was given one simple command.
Don't waste it. Don't waste your life.
We had watched him succeed and surprise and fail throughout so many films, to only give the ultimate satisfying finale in this Endgame. Sure, I would have loved Endgame to be just as good as Infinity War and as a conclusion rather than a mixed bag, but you can really tell how much the creatives cared about the fans of this universe. Making these original characters we had grown so attached to try to come together and become something greater than their own tragedies and failures for one last time. In that way, in keeping with that core theme that had connected so many to Marvel, Endgame just managed to be a decent close to this massive, epic, interconnected universe. But it wouldn't end there. Why? Because they were making so much money. And there's nothing wrong with making money. That's what a business is. The problem is how you go about it. That said, at this point, there was still enough fan momentum going for the MCU and enough characters left still to explore that it made sense to continue. But now we would be doing it without the original cast that made this series so big in the first place, except for Spider-Man, who was always big in his own right. Could Marvel keep audience interest up and give us a new massive storyline to invest in? Along came WandaVision, and for a while there it seemed like everything the MCU needed. Finally, a show that was so weird, different, and imaginative that it seemed like it was building to something new and significant for Marvel. While people were a little confused by its sitcom opening, the subsequent episodes brought about so much speculation on what the truth behind the show's central mystery was. Was Wanda being manipulated by someone to create this strange world and control everyone? She had been very much a secondary character before, but now it seemed that she was really coming into her own as a tortured and complicated individual. It seemed like the MCU really had a way forward with these new, weird experimental shows and characters. It seemed like they would be able to keep the fans' hype up. But then we got to the end, and we found out that there was nothing. The reveals of this mystery show were either obvious things anyone could have figured out from the beginning, jokes, or just non-existent. Everyone quickly moved back to their original theories about the show, like the idea that it was really comic book villain Mephisto behind everything, but the writer of the show revealed she had no idea who that character even was, and didn't really know much about the comics. This would be the beginning of the brand new MCU, where executives specifically wouldn't pick writers who had any familiarity with the source material, where the stories were not cohesive, where the characters were no longer consistent, and Disney was fire spraying out more content than ever, not just in movie form, but on Disney+. We would would next be treated to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, a show that saw most of Captain America's former supporting cast assassinated in order to explore serious social issues in the most childish way possible. What I'd like to point out with this show, and many other Marvel projects to come, is their tendency to tear old characters and plotlines down in order to build new ones up. This happened a couple times just before Endgame, but it wasn't in full force until now. Remember how powerful and important the Infinity Stones were made out to be in Infinity War? Well, a show like Loki would induce them to paperweights. Not to mention the Loki show would create a new plotline revealing that all of the events in the MCU prior were essentially forced to happen by a higher being. Not to mention Loki went from one of the best villains of Marvel to a crying simp who gets into a romantic relationship with a female version of himself. All of the Disney Plus shows were like this. Horrible cringe dialogue, horrible cringe storylines from people who didn't understand these characters. Even if one show might start out with a good opening, you know it would completely fall apart by the end. And they just would not stop pumping these shows out. Meanwhile, it wasn't much better for the movies that were released in 2021 either. Black Widow, Shang-Chi, and the Eternals. Black Widow was a prequel film released too late as it didn't provide good context for Natasha's death, contained horrible unfinished effects, and a performance from Scarlett Johansson that made it clear she wanted to be done with this series. Shang-Chi plucked an unsuccessful Marvel Comics character from the 70s and didn't really give him much more than to be a run-of-the-mill protagonist, going through a movie that had all of Marvel's recent fixings of bad, disruptive humor.
If he asked me to burn the world down, I would have asked him
for vegetarian.
And horrible CGI. The fact that no one seemed to really click with Shang-Chi's character in a major way meant that he wouldn't be a character likely to return in the future. As for the Eternals, I'm gonna be honest with you, I still haven't watched the Eternals. I just don't see a reason to. The MCU didn't feel at all like it did in the past at this point. I'd never seen such a colossal massacre of characters and world building happen all at once. But for a fleeting second, it didn't seem like it was over. Spider-Man No Way Home provided one last film that seemed to actually care about its audience. It was one last film that listened to people's desires with Spider-Man and brought back all the pain and turmoil that made his character successful in a movie that also provided a lot of fan service with the two former Spider-Man actors returning, but also managed to give those versions of the characters some closure as well. But it would be a fluke, because it was the one Marvel movie that had Sony involved with it, so it was kind of protected from the decay that was happening around it. And that decay was about to completely take hold. No one movie was ever going to kill the MCU, because no one movie created it in the first place. But if I were to point to the one that came close to doing it all by itself, it was this one. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. As I said, Marvel had managed to go for over a decade without a franchise killer like Batman and Robin or X-Men The Last Stand, but its day had finally come. It's a movie predicated on the fact that its writers hadn't even watched the show that was meant to lead up to it, that took the redemption of Wanda, the Scarlet Witch, from the end of WandaVision and shattered it into a million pieces, and perhaps the worst character assassination of the entire MCU. Wanda, once a person who fought for good, now a selfish monster willing to kill literally everyone to kidnap someone else's children for her own. Her downfall was so great that there was truly no coming back from it. Meanwhile, the movie would work to assassinate its main character as well, all of a sudden accusing Doctor Strange out to be a reckless monster who's a danger to the entire multiverse. Strange was supposed to be one of our major heroes going forward, but the movie, for whatever reason, allowed him to compromise and let himself be corrupted by evil by the end. So, there goes him. How does one go on to truly describe how everything in this movie was wrong? How every decision made is either based on someone acting out of character or just being plain stupid? How Marvel tried to throw a bone to people by having other actors and returning characters show up to make up the Illuminati, only to have those characters quickly killed off by virtue of just being stupid. How the entire movie is suddenly solved by Doctor Strange giving a teenager a pep talk. By the end of the movie, we are left with major characters we were meant to be invested in being run into the absolute gutter, and the entire concept of the multiverse that had been teased and hyped for so long was squandered, leading to nowhere. This was the first MCU film that saw people turn against it pretty quickly, but it wouldn't stop there. Because Marvel would release Thor: Love and Thunder, a movie that decided it would be a great idea to juxtapose a plotline about cancer with frat boy humor. That's right, over 2 hours of screaming goats, Thor in a hot dog suit, poorly CGI'd floating heads, and its titular hero being assaulted for another choke. This humor did not land with audiences at all. Thor in a hot dog suit. That's how you know the MCU is dead. It continued the tradition of tearing down all world building and consistency in the MCU by randomly making Thor able to give his powers to a group of children. But the worst thing that this movie did is totally undo all of Thor's character. His entire story arc from his first film, that he was a self-destructive, thoughtless narcissist who got people hurt with his blundering, brain-dead ego. These would be flaws he would grow out of, learning what it is to be selfless and a true leader. But guess what he turns back into in this film?
With minimal loss or damage. What a classic Thor adventure.
For the sake of jokes, we had another major character we once loved ground to ash. Director Taika Waititi had no real love for this universe, and it really showed in this movie. From Chris Hemsworth's comments, it wasn't a very enjoyable experience for him either. He knew that they messed up with this movie, and he was right. People turned against Thor: Love and Thunder instantly. What happened to this universe where we were supposed to root for these characters as heroes? Where was the character development that was important? It was all being torn down. And I'd like to say it ended there, but no, it just kept going and going and going. It was relentless. More shows, more movies.
Endless trash!
Because then in August, we got She-Hulk, a show that I think I can safely say is Marvel's rock bottom. A 30-minute comedy starring a 30-something career woman who cares about nothing more than finding her next meaningless hookup and finding people to tell her how amazing she is. So, you know, the perfect character to try to make into a superhero. She-Hulk was a show that felt like it was made for people who hate superheroes. What made it even more memeable is that Marvel didn't actually have a budget for this show that had to star a 10-foot green lady, so, the CGI was not the most flattering part of the show, I'll say that much. Not to mention, the writers didn't even care enough about their own show to research about how legal processes work for their show about a lawyer. And they didn't even care about their show enough to give it a proper conclusion. They just wound up making Jen break the fourth wall to admit how bad the show was and retcon it in order to even get to a conclusion. Because nothing makes the audience appreciate a bad show any more than the show itself admitting it's bad. Wow, the Hulk had an illegitimate son. Woohoo! I can't wait to get back to this plotline. The crude, cynical tone went against everything these superheroes we loved were supposed to be. The show was pretty much made fun of and universally rejected by everyone. For me, I was looking at this show and thinking, what is this? This isn't the MCU. It was like a completely different franchise I couldn't recognize. If this was the MCU that I had been introduced to, I would have never become a fan. But this endless pile-on of horrible content just would never end. I understand not everything that happened with Wakanda Forever was the creative's fault. Chadwick Boseman's sudden death shocked everyone, and you could tell the pain the cast carries throughout the movie. However, I think it was a major mistake not to honor Chadwick Boseman's wishes and recast T'Challa. Without Black Panther, Wakanda Forever became another corner of the MCU that collapsed due to lack of direction, confusing creative decisions, and a nonsense plot wrapped around scenes of actions and explosives that now truly were hollow without a decent story to back them up. It's no wonder that people seem to start checking out of the MCU after this. The following February, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania would become the very first Marvel movie to bomb since the initial explosive success of the franchise. At this point, it was like all of the films of the MCU and their problems just all ran together, tearing things down that came before to build new things up, only to have those new things not work out either. And at this point, it seemed like the bad humor of the MCU that poisoned the series for so long had mutated into a new form of horrendous.
A big hole. How many holes do you have? I'm sorry, is that a personal question? I don't have any holes.
Maybe Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, flawed film as it is, gave us one last gasp of actually decent entertainment, something that we hadn't seen from Marvel for quite some time. But director James Gunn just happened to be leaving. That film was a final death cough for a dead franchise. Now we're going headfirst from that into the Marvels, which is projected to be the biggest flop of the series thus far, signifying people's near total disengagement with the MCU. I want everyone to notice something though. Remember all of the reasons I gave for people loving the MCU? That people loved watching very flawed characters try to overcome their flaws and differences in order to do something good? Well, that's not what the MCU is about anymore. The heroes aren't heroes. they're narcissists, idiots, and psychopaths. We used to be invested in this because we wanted to see the characters we love progress, but there's no longer any character progression at Marvel. There's just character assassination. The tone of the MCU used to be that of excitement and inspiration, but now it's just cynical and crude. We used to hold on to the MCU even through the rough patches because we wanted to see this big interconnected story through to the end. But now, what is any of this sludge leading towards? What's the MCU really about? It used to have films that attempted to get a little deeper with its themes, but now it's just nothing. Throughout this video, I've talked a lot about the criticisms levied against the MCU and how I thought a lot of them were unfair. But now I feel like the MCU has become everything people accused it of being. Just a poorly written, soulless world of bad CGI and explosions. Unfortunately, I'm wondering if some of the executives saw fans of the MCU the same way these critics did. That we were just brain-dead idiots who had no good reason for enjoying Marvel movies. And that we just accept anything. Well, we were willing to accept a lot because we believed in these characters and this universe. But we weren't going to accept anything. So why did I stop caring about the MCU? Because the MCU has become far removed from anything and everything that I loved about it in the first place. I don't want to watch another Disney Plus show or Marvel movie, not just because I know it will be terribly made, but because I know it will just tear down or recontextualize something I liked and taint my experience even with the things that had come before. And so, it seems that the biggest cinematic experiment ever has finally crashed and burned. It's insane to think after Marvel built up such a love and confidence for itself for over 10 years that they all of a sudden drove it all into the ground in the span of just 2 years. It's really tragic, especially considering what these characters meant to me. At the same time, I don't really feel so bad. I had Marvel movies for the better part of 10 years, and it gave me so much. Remember how I said that the first Avengers unlocked something in my brain? It was because of that movie that I started to have conversations about what character development and dimension was as I discussed with people what worked in these movies, what didn't work, and what I wanted to see happen in the future. If I were to point to the movie that had the most influence on me wanting to be a filmmaker, it was The Avengers. It was because of that movie that made me start studying films, making sure I saw all the classics, and even got into foreign films I would have never seen before. You see, Martin Scorsese, the MCU can inspire young people to check out other films. The Avengers movies were like my friends all throughout my teen years. With these movies helping me to make friends over discussing them, remembering the joy of people's investment over seeing what would happen to their favorite heroes next, how we all came together in the end to watch them finally overcome their final threat. And guess what? These movies, with all their highs and lows, are still there for us to experience, forever. My only regret is that I wished it ended sooner. That we just had time to enjoy these movies for the positives that they had instead of rushing into the churn of sludge that ended up tainting people's view of it. Better to preserve something good than force it to go on forever. To quote Vision from one of the lesser Marvel films,
"But a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts."
The sad thing is that Marvel still has more of these bad movies on the horizon that are going to be released. But the positive thing is, I don't have to watch any more of them. And why would I when they're just going to taint my enjoyment of the past? I'd rather stick to the Marvel that was good. So, if you don't mind me, I'll just enjoy Marvel for what it was. Forever.
Are you Thor, the god of hammers?
I'm not as strong as you.
No. You're stronger.
Come on, Spider-Man. Come on, Spider-Man.
You win wars with guts.
The price of freedom is high. It always has been. And it's a price I'm willing to pay. And if I'm the only one, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet I'm not.
You have such a capacity for goodness. You always excelled, but not because you crave success, but because of your fear of failure. It's precisely what kept you from greatness. Arrogance and fear still keep you from learning the simplest and most significant lesson of all.
Which is?
It's not about you.
There are the hands that made us. And then there are the hands that guide the hands.
I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
Puny god.
I'm Mary Poppins, y'all!
Thank you all for watching. This was a huge video to complete. If you want to support my channel, please consider joining Patreon, as others have already done. And as I mentioned in this video, I also do short films, and now I have a bit more of a budget and equipment for one. So if you want to support that, also make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and I have more great videos coming for you guys in the future, and I will see you guys next time.